London. Smithfield Market. April Cinch. Yichen Wu Bai Senshi. The crowd gathered in the cold spring morning to witness something unprecedented in English legal history, a new form of execution specifically authorized by Parliament just weeks earlier. Richard Roose. A cook employed in the household of the Bishop of Rochester stood chained near a massive iron cauldron, already steaming over a roaring fire. He had been convicted of poisoning soup intended for the bishop's table, killing 2 members of the household and sickening 17 others. King Henry VIII, obsessed with the threat of poisoning after several attempts on his own life, had personally demanded that Parliament create a new punishment, death by boiling alive. The Act of Parliament passed in February 1531 specified that poisoners would be boiled to death in water or lead. The language was deliberate, not drowned quickly, but cooked slowly to maximize suffering and serve as public warning. Roose's execution would be the first under this new law. Guards forced him into the cauldron when the water was merely hot, not yet boiling. This was calculated cruelty if they had thrown him into already boiling liquid. A shock might have killed him within minutes. Instead, the fire beneath the cauldron had been carefully regulated to raise the temperature gradually over approximately 1 hour. Contemporary chroniclers estimated several thousand Londoners watched from the market square and surrounding buildings. Vendors sold food and ale. Mothers held children on their shoulders for better views. The spectacle was designed not just to kill Roose, but to create a memory so visceral that poisoning would become unthinkable to anyone who witnessed or heard about this execution. What happened over the next hour would be recorded in multiple sources with disturbing consistency. Roose screamed continuously for the first 15 minutes as the water temperature climbed past the point of human tolerance. His skin began blistering visibly, turning bright red, then darker as the outer layers of epidermis separated from underlying tissue. Around minute 20, his screams became intermittent as shock began to set in the body's emergency response to catastrophic trauma, flooding the system with endorphins that provided brief moments of dissociation from unbearable pain. But shock was not mercy. It was temporary reprieve that wore off within minutes, returning Roose to full awareness of what was happening to his body. By minute 30, witnesses reported that the water had reached full boil, creating a roiling surface that obscured the victim's body beneath clouds of steam. The fat beneath Roose's skin began to liquefy, creating a grotesque layer of melted tissue that separated from muscle. His hair had already fallen out in clumps. The outer layers of his eyes had begun to cloud from the heat. Around minute 45, his movements became sporadic muscle contractions rather than conscious struggle. The water had penetrated through skin and fat to the muscle tissue itself, cooking it like meat in a stew. Death likely came between 50 and 60 minutes after he entered the cauldron, caused by a combination of shock, dehydration, and the catastrophic failure of vital organs that could no longer function at sustained temperatures above 60 degrees Celsius. When they finally pulled his remains from the cauldron, witnesses described flesh that sloughed off bones at the slightest touch. A body essentially rendered into its component parts by sustained heat. The act authorizing boiling remained English law for 9 years until it was repealed in 1540. During that period, court records document at least 3 more executions by this method, though Roose's remained the most infamous. The punishment was eventually abandoned not because it was considered too cruel, but because it was too expensive and logistically complicated compared to hanging or burning. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate spectators. Tavern conversations repeated details of Roose's execution for months afterward. The threat of boiling became a weapon in itself. Prosecutors would mention it during trials of suspected poisoners, knowing that juries who remembered Smithfield would convict on minimal evidence rather than risk unleashing poison in their communities. This was torture as public policy. Suffering, weaponized to enforce social order through fear that would outlast any individual victim. But boiling, for all its horror, killed relatively quickly compared to devices designed to extend agony over days or even weeks. The Iron Maiden, though possibly more legend than historical reality, represented a different philosophy of punishment, not quick terror, but slow, methodical destruction that gave victims hours to contemplate their approaching death while spikes gradually penetrated deeper into their bodies. Nuremberg, Germany, 16th century. The device stood in the castle dungeon, an iron cabinet approximately 7 feet tall, shaped like a female figure with a hinged front that opened to reveal the interior. The name Iron Maiden suggested a woman's form, but the interior was lined with iron spikes of varying lengths, carefully positioned to penetrate the body without immediately striking vital organs. Modern historians debate whether the Iron Maiden was genuinely used during the medieval period or was largely a 19th century creation designed to sensationalize torture history for museum displays. The most famous example, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, was likely constructed in the 1800s based on earlier torture concepts, rather than being an authentic medieval device. However, the principle it embodied in closure with penetrating implements appeared in various forms across European torture practices, whether the specific cabinet-shaped maiden existed or not. Similar concepts were documented spiked enclosures, coffins lined with nails, and restraint devices that use the victim's own body weight to force them onto sharp points. The psychological element was consistent across these variations. The victim would be shown the device before being placed inside, allowing anticipatory terror to build. The act of closing the door, whether on an Iron Maiden or any similar spiked enclosure, created a moment of absolute helplessness as darkness enclosed the victim, and the first pressure of spikes touched skin without yet penetrating. The spikes themselves were engineered with brutal precision. They needed to be long enough to penetrate deeply into flesh, but positioned so they missed the heart, major arteries, and other structures that would cause rapid death. The goal was to create multiple puncture wounds that would bleed slowly, causing death over hours from blood loss and shock rather than immediate organ failure. Some designs included spikes positioned near the eyes, not penetrating them initially, but close enough that any movement or struggle might cause the victim to impale their own face. Records from 16th century Germany describe torture sessions that lasted 6 to 24 hours, though these may refer to spiked confinement devices generally, rather than the specific Iron Maiden form we recognize today. The victim's smallest movement drove spikes deeper, creating a horrifying feedback loop. Pain caused involuntary flinching, which caused more penetration, which caused more pain. Breathing became a measured exercise, as the rise and fall of the chest determined how deeply spikes penetrated the torso. This transformed an autonomous bodily function into an agonizing choice: breathe deeply and feel spikes slide between ribs, or take shallow breaths that left the victim gasping and hypoxic, accelerating the body's deterioration. Some surviving accounts describe victims who survived initial placement in spiked devices for 12 to 18 hours, finally dying from a combination of blood loss, dehydration, and the systemic shock that occurs when the body can no longer maintain blood pressure or regulate core temperature. But the Iron Maiden and similar devices represented elaborate torture requiring specialized construction and maintenance. Most torture was far more improvised, using simple tools that any blacksmith could produce and any interrogator could operate.